Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining the webinar this afternoon. We have a great turnout of EMCRs highlighting the relevance and topical nature of this session. We are delighted to have two experienced speakers with us this afternoon, Tamara and Deb, speaking about project management and governance, administration and reporting. But before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide region. We recognise the Kaurna people's cultural, spiritual, physical and emotional connection with their land. We honour and pay our respects to Kaurna elders, both past and present, and all generations of Kaurna people, now and into the future. So for many of us, getting the grant, whether that be a large or small grant, and fortunate for me, I was awarded a WHRTN EMCR grant a couple of years ago, it's challenging, with the funding pot often limited and highly competitive. But unfortunately, the hard part isn't over once we are awarded the grant, particularly when it's the first or second grant. Navigating how on earth to start the project, who to potentially employ, and how to manage the funds and project reporting and monitoring can be stressful. This is rarely something we are taught, but somehow are expected to know what to do. Most of us are scientists, not project managers, so understanding how to navigate these new territories can be challenging. We very much welcome Tamara and Deb today to provide some expert advice and tips and tricks regarding project management and governance. They will both speak for about 15 minutes each, and then we will take questions at the end, even if you put some in the chat box throughout the speakers' sessions. So our first speaker today is Tamara Hooper, currently employed by Health Translation SA as a project manager. Tamara was recently the project manager leading the registry nested clinical trials portfolio within the Australian Orthopaedic Association National Joint Replacement Registry, and prior to that, established the ACOR-TAVI registry. Tamara's initial healthcare experience includes intensive care nursing, ICU clinical trials, clinical practice improvement, safety, and quality. From here, she moved into the commercial medical device industry, working for two different companies, and was appointed national roles within education, marketing, and sales. From 2010 to 15, Tamara moved back into the world of research, safety, and quality as a project manager on two large NHMRC grants related to the assessment of the appropriateness of care for adults and children. As an aside to this role, her continued interest in safety and quality led to an opportunity of teaching the methodology and practice of root cause analysis on behalf of SA Health, Queensland Health, NT Health, and the Australian Council for Healthcare Standards. Tamara continues to be passionate about facilitating healthcare improvements at individual, group, and system levels. Our second speaker today is Deborah Turnbull, a professor in psychology at the University of Adelaide and co-chair of the SA Steering Committee of WHRTN. She has been actively involved in women's health research and women's professional development since the early 1990s. She has chaired the university's Gender Equity and Diversity Committee and was a member of the working party responsible for the successful bid for the university's SAGE Athena Swan Silver Award. Her research program into women's health covers maternity services and breast cancer screening. She is an active mentor and has undertaken this role both informally and formally as part of the university's Women's Professional Development Network. We very much look forward to hearing Tamara and Deb speak now about how to implement and manage our research projects. Thanks, Tamara.
Thanks, Jessica. Wow, that was a very long bio, wasn't it? I need to actually just cut it down a little bit, I think, just to get to the nitty-gritty. Okay, talking about the nitty-gritty, let's talk about Project Management 101. So as you've heard, I've been a project manager for a few years now, and on a myriad of different projects. So these are really sort of my thoughts around, what you need to do, I guess, when you get a project, starting from the initial right through to the end. So the first thing is, I guess, the definition of project management, and it's really the application of knowledge, skills, tools, and techniques in order to meet the requirements of your project. What are my secrets to success? So always plan, always plan. Then it's a matter of monitoring, continue to monitor throughout your whole project. Communication is key. Make sure that everybody understands what it is that you're doing. Add lots of contingency into your project. This might be sort of buffers around time, around money, and also mitigation for projects as well. There are six key elements around project management, and that is around the scope, the timelines and schedules, risk, quality, budget, and benefits. And I'm going to talk about these in a little bit more detail. But the first thing is, I guess, just to acknowledge that plans are just plans. They do change. They're not set in concrete, but they do need sort of an initial work on so that you can continue to make sure that you're actually tracking in the right place. Thanks, Deb. So the first thing is to talk about scope. So in your project plan, it's really important to put in there what is actually in and what's out. So what are you doing and what are you not doing? It's about monitoring scope creep. So when somebody comes to you and says, oh, I think that as part of your project, you really need to be adding in this, and you think, oh, that wasn't really in my original thing. But it's okay. It's okay to look at that. It's okay to think about, is that really important for me to do? And also, while you're doing that, to think about, well, what's the impact on my project if I do that? It's okay if you pivot occasionally. And what I mean by pivot is you continue to have your what's in, but you might actually move direction a little bit from what your original scope and your original plan is. When you're setting your goals and objectives, make sure that they are SMART. They need to be specific. They need to be measurable. You need to be able to achieve them. Don't set them so that you're not ever going to achieve them. Make sure that they're relevant and make sure that they're time bound. And the other thing that I would say is that as part of your scope, you need to also put in there a communication plan. And your communication plan then helps you sort of set out your meetings, who it is that you're going to meet with, who's included in that, how you're actually going to achieve that communication. Thanks, Steph. So the next thing is around your timelines and schedules. So how long will it take to actually complete your project? What are the various phases? So identifying what your project phases. Now, they might be a startup. So your startup might be things like, is the project actually viable? What's the business case? Where am I going to get the funding from? Then you move into the next phase, once you've possibly got that funding, into an initiate phase. And this is where you'd actually pull in those key elements into your project plan around your scope. So it's around really just sort of defining exactly what it is and what you're going to do. Then you move into the delivery, so the doing part of it. And then finally you have a closeout phase. The second part is actually identifying your tasks, deliverables and responsibilities, and actually estimating the durations as to how long these things will take. And as I said before, make sure that you add in, if you can, lots of contingency and buffers. And that might be buffer around resources, it might be buffer around finances, it might be buffer around time, so that you can feel that you can actually safely achieve what it is that you've set out to do. There's a number of tools that you can use as far as your timelines and scheduling. And some of you may have heard, things called Gantt charts. Gantt charts is really just a fancy Excel spreadsheet where you put in your project tasks and how long you actually think things are actually going to take. Now, there are companies that provide specific Gantt charts, such as Microsoft Project. There's another thing called Monday.com. There's Atlassian Trello. So these are all tools that are available. There's also templates that you can download off the internet if you just type in Gantt charts. The other thing that you might want to think about when you're working out your timelines is how you're actually going to run your project. Are you actually going to use a waterfall approach? So your waterfall might be, well, I'm going to do this part of it, and then once I've done that, then I'm going to move down, and then I'm going to do this part of it, and then I'm going to move down, and then I'm going to move this part of it. So it's really working out how you're actually going to do that. As the third dot point says, there are other sort of online courses and books also available that help you with project management. Thank you, Deb. The next thing is around building the right team. So as part of your funding application, you may have actually nominated who should actually be part of that team. And that's great, but the actual people that are actually going to do the project may actually differ a little bit from your initial funding application, and that's okay. The thing you really need to work out is who needs to be involved in order to get the job done. And who do you need to report to? So who do you need to report up to? So they'll be part of your project team, and then who are the actual doers? Once you've got your tasks and your deliverables nutted out, then it's much easier to actually work out who's actually going to be part of that project team. And you will have also mapped out the different phases of your project as well. As mentioned earlier, the other part in here is also to encourage open communication and collaboration. So within that project team, how are you going to communicate? Who needs to be involved? How often are you going to meet? Is it somebody that just needs to be informed, or do they actually have a job within that communication? What other approaches might you actually use around communication other than meetings? Are you thinking that you might actually want to put something out there on social media or newsletters? Or do you need to communicate just within your area, or is it actually a national project? So yeah, there's lots of different ways. So is it just within the team, or is it also external as well? Thank you, Deb. The next thing we're going to talk about is a responsibility assignment matrix. Now, this is a tool that I quite often use. I don't always use it, but I quite often use it for very big projects. What it does is it actually provides clarity on the roles and responsibilities. So what you do is you actually map out your key activities, so your tasks and your deliverables. And then you identify who the individual groups are that are actually going to be involved, as far as who needs to sign off on stuff, who needs to be aware, who's going to be involved, who's actually going to do the stuff. And then you actually assign them the different responsibility types. So you'll see here that we've got responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed, and that's what forms the RACI. So responsible team members are they're the actual doers. The accountable type is the authority people or the decision makers. So they might be, that might be the principal investigator, it might be the board, it might be a steering committee. So whoever takes that overall ownership. People who are allocated, or the tasks that are allocated into the console, are actually those you're actually seeking input and feedback from people. So they might be people such as your legal team, your finance team, ICT, those sorts of people who may actually be involved in your project. So you might actually want to consult them. They also might be responsible for various tasks as well. And then finally, you've got the informed type. So they're the people that, if you think about when you're writing an email, that you'd actually put them in the CC box, okay? So they need to be kept in the loop, but they're not actually part of being that sort of decision maker level. So on to the next slide, we have an example of a RACI, and this is one that I put together. So you can see the first thing to do is, and I would add this to the project plan, I've listed my activities or my tasks in that first column. And then what I've done is I've actually listed the roles and the people who or that are part of the project team across the top. And then I go in and I actually allocate an A, an R, a C, and an I to all of the different boxes in here. So the roles as well as the activities. And some you can see here have a bit of a duplication. So they might be accountable, but they might also be responsible. So to me, somebody who is responsible is actually the person who's actually going to do the thing, do the actual task, who's been delegated that authority to actually go and do that task. So one of the things that you need to do just as part of that RACI is also, once you've finished creating that is actually to share that with the people who are involved for feedback. And it's a good way of communicating to sort of say, look, these are all the activities and these are the people allocated, and these are your roles within each of those. So moving on to risks. So one of the things that you can do is to really, at the very early stage, is actually identify what your risks are for this project. Now, you can actually include this as part of your project plan, or it may actually be that you actually want to, you can jump onto the internet and find a risk register and actually list all of your risks on that. And then once you've actually identified all of your risks, then apply a risk matrix to it. So it's a consequence versus likelihood. So what's the likelihood of the risk actually happening versus the impact or the consequence? So, for example, if you suddenly decide that one of your risks is one of your team members resigns, for example, within your project. Now, what's the likelihood of that happening? Well, it might be a medium likelihood, it might be high, it might be low. And then what would be the consequence to your project if that actually happened? And there, if you have a look on the internet, there are ways, and they have all sort of coloured boxes to show whether it's actually a low, a medium, or a high, to define what that actual risk actually is. As part of that, what you need to do in identifying those risks is actually work out strategies of how you actually manage those risks. So what do you need to put in place in order to mitigate the risk from actually happening? So that might be, you might need to seek, another source of funding, for example, as a backup, or you might have to, work through some staffing issues. So, or communication plans. Communication plans is actually a really good one for mitigating risk. So there's those sorts of things that you can do. One of the things that you do also is during your project is to continue to monitor your risks throughout the whole project, and also document any new risks. When we then talk about, you would have heard, risks versus issues. So one of the things is that occasionally your risk will turn into an issue. So a risk is something, I think about a risk as something that is potentially going to happen, whereas an issue is something that is actually happening right now. So it's a risk that's turned into an issue. One of the things, really good things about having your risks documented and your mitigations documented is that at the end of your project, it's a really good way to be able to go back and say, okay, right, now how many of those actually came through and actually happened? And it's a way of being able to, into your next project, go, well, I'm not going to perhaps go down that same track the next time. These are lessons learned. On to quality. So at the beginning, you need to also think about what you're collecting and how you're going to collect it. What's the frequency of your monitoring and your reporting? And this all gets pulled together in a data management plan. And data management plan might just be one aspect of your project plan. So how are you going to do it? Are there existing standard operating procedures and policies within your area that you can actually follow? Or do you actually have to create your own? So how are you actually going to collect the data? So that becomes a standard operating procedure. It's like, I'm going to collect it this way. This is who else is involved, and this is how I'm going to actually manage it. So that becomes your operating procedure. It means that if you step away from the project, somebody else can actually step in because you've clearly documented how you've actually done that. One of the good things at the end of the project also is to be able to show the evidence of what you've actually adhered to. And again, this is a good way of being able to, with your data management plan, mitigate any sort of risk, is to sort of say, this is how I'm actually going to manage it. And for my final slide is talk a little bit about budget, costs, finance. So at the initial outset, you would have had a little bit of a fuzzy thought about, well, how much do I actually think this is actually going to cost? And then what I would do is, okay, once you've got that allocated funding, is to, in your project plan, allocate a section for your budget. Break it down into how you're actually going to spend it, who's actually accountable, who can actually sign off on it. And this will also be one of those risks. What happens if I run out of money? Thank you, and over to you, Deb.
Thanks so much, Tamara. So the second part of the webinar is about research governance. So by this, we mean basically the activities that implement not just the requirements of your grant, but also the principles as well as the standards. And one example of this is the way that you address protection of your research participants, including privacy and confidentiality, safety, quality, financial probity, of course. Tamara's commented on budgets, the legal and regulatory matters, and as you've already heard, about risk management and monitoring. Now, the way that you do this really depends on the life stage of your research. But I would say that the general principles that underlie all of this is the importance of knowing who does what in your organization and how it all fits together. So having a working knowledge, for example, about what your legal and risk office does, what your research office does. Ideally, you would know the individuals in those offices, but a lot of our organizations now are moving to a more bureaucratic kind of administrative framework. So it's not always easy to know particular individuals. I would say that it's always important to take advice and share your concerns. Don't wait until things become really quite out of hand before you talk to people about it. Be prepared to start small in your grant applications and build over time. It's important to be adaptive. It's important to be flexible. It's really important to leverage support, which I'll talk about in a moment. And as Tamara said, always have a sense of who does what within your team. So this is taken directly from the Research Governance Handbook of the NHMRC, and I'm going to focus on stages 2, 3, and 4. Stage 2, obviously, is when you actually get your grant, then when you deliver it, and how you close it out. But let's start with the project design. So in relation to preparing your proposal, it's always useful to have an eye to existing and emerging research priorities. You can do this by becoming familiar with the various policy statements that pertain to Australia, such as the Women's Health Policy. You're more likely to be successful in your research if it's got a nod to a particular policy area. Now, with regard to preparing your proposal and its initial assessment, it is, if you have time, and I really recommend that you try to do this, is to liaise with your research office and consider getting someone to critique your project against the criteria of the call. Most research organisations and universities have reviewers who are able to do that. Have a full range of funding organisations in mind. Think about MRFF, NHMRC, but also think about the smaller, more bespoke grant organisations, for example, like Rotary. Develop your proof of concept and demonstrable evidence that you can work together as a team. You're more likely to be successful if you can demonstrate that you've got a track record together as a team. Aim to publish your accomplishments as a team. I would also suggest that you look into the read and write licenses of your various organisations. These are the licenses that give you access to open access journals without having to pay for upfront for the licenses. Now, in relation to your collaborators, it's important to think and make sure that you consider consumers, of course, particularly for work that's got a translation focus. Tamara's spoken a lot about collaborators, but also think about mentors. Mentors are people who usually are not directly collaborating with you on the grant. They're quite separate from the grant. And this is important because it's important that you're mentored by individuals who don't have conflicts of interest. They're really thinking of your career and your best interests at heart, rather than pursuing their own career interests via a particular grant that you're working on together. So let's move to the main part of the talk, which is about what you do once you get the grant. Well, obviously, you have to ensure ethical review. You can do this by firstly considering and taking advice as to whether the application should go to a low or a high risk committee. Most organisations will have low risk committees. We've got one here at the University of Adelaide within the School of Psychology. These are committees that will assess an application which is, as it says, is of low risk. But critically, these particular committees are fully constituted ethics committees of the NHMRC. Now, if you're doing work that has consumer and community participation, you have to ensure that you write your ethical review or your ethics application with the pertinent guidelines in mind. Such as NHMRC and Consumers Health Forum of Australia guidelines. Similarly, if you are working and partnering alongside First Nations peoples, you should ensure that you are working within those particular guidelines. Now, with regard to finance, it's not uncommon for you to get a grant which is less than what you've requested. This is where flexibility is going to come into play. And this is where, as Tamara's made reference to, being clear about what's in and out of scope. I would strongly recommend that you keep an audit trail of your spends, because there's always a lag time between your spends and what appears in organisational databases. So you don't want to risk looking at your budget on the database and thinking that you've got more than you actually have. So keep an audit trail. With regard to risk management, Tamara has spoken very comprehensively about this. I do want to point out that this is particularly important with MRFF applications, and frequently your research office will have templates and matrices that you can use. And oftentimes they will have previously successful grants that you can apply to have a confidential look at. Now, with regard to the legal and administration, obviously it depends on the nature of the research. For example, clinical research will have more complex legal and administrative requirements than some other research. But in any case, most research now, particularly multi-institutional research, will require you to have contracts and agreements with your partners in place. And you shouldn't think that you have to do this by yourself. Your commercial research branch of your organisation will often have templates there that you can draw on. Similarly, intellectual property, it's really important to to know the authorship policies of your institution, and frequently they will have online declarations that you can ask your co-investigators to sign. Also, be alive to the fact that when things go wrong, in relation when there's disagreements with respect to authorship. And, you know, if you've discussed it fairly and frankly at the outset, you know, hopefully this won't arise, but sometimes they do. And again, you should not think you need to deal with this yourself. You should link in with your research integrity office. They are people who are much more skilled and knowledgeable about these things. Now, with regard to project delivery, monitoring is something that Tamara spoke to. I would say briefly that the best way to monitor is to work backwards from your delivery date. So work backwards from your delivery date and schedule against, using your tools, schedule against your various deliverables. So you might have a first year report that's due, make sure that that goes into your monitoring plan. Complaints handling, this is also very important. It is encompassed at least partially by making sure on your various ethics forms that you're clear about where people can go to for complaints. And if you're doing clinical work and trials that require a data monitoring committee, you should also be clear to the data monitoring committee who they can go to independently of the research team if they have concerns. With regard to reporting, keep in mind that you're going to have multiple stakeholders. You're going to have your granting body, but you also may have your consumer groups. So think about reporting in multiple formats. Think about using, for example, more diagrammatic formats like infographics for consumer groups. Think about being creative in the way that you report. And finally, with regard to project closure, there are some critical things you need to do. Be very aware about the timelines for the final ethics reports. These might be due after the completion of your project. Be very clear about the way you're going to store and decommission data. And you need to ensure that you're doing it in a way that is entirely in line with your ethics statements. And familiarize yourself with various digital object repositories such as Box and Figshare. This is the best way of storing your data for the required time. And some closing comments before I hand back to Jess for the Q&A. Tamara and I have outlined a lot of information in the webinar. None of this is insurmountable. With good planning, it's all achievable. Another aspect to accomplishing your goal is to have the right kind of mindset. So to persevere, aim to deal with setbacks in a positive and resolute fashion. Don't be put off if you make one call to the research branch and they can't help you. Think about how you might circle back to that. Have your support structures in place, not just your collaborators, but also your mentors. And finally, the key to it all is to be adaptable and to have a plan B in mind. Thank you, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for your presentations. They were really insightful and provided much depth, really, on the importance of managing and monitoring our projects. So we now have about 20 minutes to discuss any questions that anyone may have for Tamara and Deb. And if you do, please raise your hand or put a question in the chat or Q&A, and we'll be happy to take them. I can see one question there already, either for you, Tamara or Deb. The question is, if you are new to this project management and budgets, what are the best guides available on the internet to guide the money allocations and the selections of a project? So which ones are the most reliable?
Yeah, thank you, Darren. I can see that question. Look, I don't know, I've never actually used a template that I've downloaded from the internet. I've just sort of have worked out in my own mind, and you probably will have done this anyway for your project funding application. And most of what you're actually going to be spending is on people resources. So it's salaries. And once you know what your deliverable is going to be and how you're actually going to do it, then you can go, okay, right, well, how many people do I need in order to be able to deliver that, and an estimate of how long it will take and how many hours. And that's how I've sort of worked backwards from, as Deb said, you work backwards from that deliverable to be able to determine, you know, how much and how big that might be and who needs to be involved. The other thing is, I guess there's, you know, there might be some other hidden costs, such as infrastructure, and which are not a part of large grant funding bodies like the MRFF and NHMRC don't provide that. So I imagine that, you know, within the academic environments, you know, those costs are still real, but how do you get the money to pay for, you know, a new project manager's laptop? I'm not sure where that comes from. Deb, any clues?
Yeah, thanks, Tamara. This is a really good question. I agree with Tamara. The majority of the work that we do, you know, the vast majority of the spend is on your human capital, if you like, your team. The way to work out what you should be paying people is to go to the enterprise agreement of your institution. And the enterprise agreement will have a listing of the various staffing levels, both full-time equivalent and casual on an hourly rate, as well as those for academic staff and professional staff. I would encourage you to do that rather than some sort of back of the envelope calculation, because the enterprise agreements take into account all of the various pay rises, and they also take into account on costs oftentimes, not always. If they don't, then you should find out from HR about additional on costs. And, you know, they're typically, depending on the institution, in the vicinity of, you know, about maybe 30 to 35%. With regard to budgeting for your consumables, such as laptops, for example, if you're in a university, I would advise you to purchase that kind of equipment via the IT office of your university. The reason for doing that is that they will be able to provide the servicing and keep it up to date for you. And they'll also be able to make sure that you get all of the relevant programs and packages and updates. And critically, they will also ensure that all of the cybersecurity is encompassed on the laptop. The other thing too I would suggest is sometimes another consumable is to do with payment of your consumers. And again, with regard to those guidelines, I look at the ones that are pertinent that come from NHMRC and also from the Australian Health Consumers Forum. And another consumable is oftentimes things such as, and these becoming less used, but, you know, pen and paper tests, for example, sending out mail, receiving mail. Again, the best way to do this is to work out through some sort of unit cost per participant. Don't make it too fine-grained. But equally, try to make sure that you've got, you know, you've included the follow-up questionnaires for your participants as well. It's not just a one-off.
Thanks, that's really great advice. I just thought I'd follow up as well. The budgets that I often do, I actually follow up with HR as well in terms of how much I should be paying. My particular research assistants or whoever, I just find it's really helpful, double check that you're not under or overpaying them as well. And in terms of getting the work done, I think that's more of a personal thing as to how long you think it might take to do the lab work, for example, or write the paper. I think that's probably a bit more research specific, so it's probably a bit of a tricky question to ask how long time's taken for the salaries and those sorts of tasks. Najma's got a great follow-up question as well, in terms of how funds are meant to be spent, but also more about who. Is it the lead investigator? Do they have complete control, or is it over the budget, or is it more around the administering organisation who dictates how much or how the money is spent? So yeah, great question.
Such a good question. Tamara, do you want to start?
Oh, well, I guess I don't have, as far as administrating organisation, I can't really answer that one. And the ones that I have been involved in, it has been the lead investigator who is accountable. So the principal investigator is accountable for receiving those funds. And so they have, the ultimate. So they are the accountable in the RACI that I showed. So they do have complete control.
And
at the end of the day.
I would agree with that 100%. At the end of the day, it's the principal investigator who has the authority. Having said that, a good principal investigator will, consider the perspectives of the others in the team, but ultimately it's their decision about the spend.
Yep, that's great. Thank you. Nadia has a question. One of my issues is at people management. Although I have a framework and informed the stakeholders of how communication should be carried out, I still have personnel in my team who changes the plan that the other team members have painstakingly worked on. So all of these without informing me until they dig out and find out what's actually going on. So how can they deal with such issues? And I think this is probably common to a number of research projects and research teams as well. How do we deal with that sort of thing? Changes to the plan and so on.
Tamara?
Yeah, look, and I guess we talked about scope creep. We talked about roles and responsibilities. I think it's about making sure at the very beginning that all of that is documented, and that when those things do happen, it's a matter of evaluating that and sort of saying, okay, right now, what's actually changed? Is that part of a scope creep? And if it is it something that we should be taking on and changing direction a little bit, or is it actually going to have a big impact on the project? And if it's going to have a big impact on the project, and that I mean is the time, the delivery time, any of your costs, resources, etc., then it's probably something that you should go down that line and go that way. But I think it's about actually making sure that you've got those clear tasks, those clear roles and responsibilities, and communicating those out early, so that everybody knows who's actually what's actually assigned to them and who's actually responsible.
The other thing I would add is I think first seek to understand their reasons for doing what they're doing. Is it a case that they genuinely, don't understand? Or is it they're, motivated by other things? But if you understand at the outset what's behind the behaviour, you can tailor make your response.
Yep.
I think there is, I'm just reading through the chat, Jess. I think that there's a little bit extra information in there too, Deb, that it's actually a industry, just lost it now. It's actually industry research that they're leading. And so it's about, I think in that situation, it's about going back to industry and saying, okay, right, well, you're actually changing the scope now. And with change of scope comes change of budget,
yes,
plans, resources, and that's okay if they want to pay.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't realize that. Sometimes if you're an early to mid-career researcher, being clear to your industry partner about that can be really tough. And if you feel like you can't do it by yourself, sometimes it's possible to get someone from your engagement branch to perhaps talk to your industry partner with you. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Deb. Another question here, can you speak a bit more about the program management tools? So using spreadsheets, probably many of us do that. Is it worth investing time in learning to use additional sorts of tools, or how do we navigate that? I think that's probably a good one for tomorrow.
Yeah, thanks. I still use tools that I've developed, and I just sort of slowly reiterate them and change them a little bit. And so one of the first NHMRC projects that when I was at UniSA managing that, I think I started in 2010. And so there are those sorts of things that I actually developed, and they were a little bit sort of spreadsheet-like, but I've just continued to develop them. Or I find something on the internet that actually works for what it is that I'm looking for, because it might have some little smarts in the in the Excel spreadsheet. A lot of my colleagues actually use Monday.com as a project management tool. I haven't too much got into Microsoft Project, because I find it a little bit, it's okay, but it can be a little bit clunky and a little bit it's not as easy to use. And when you then have to spend time and invest time learning how to use it, you just think, I just need to just get on and just do this and use something that's really simple.
Yeah, great. Deb, did you want to add?
Yeah, well, adding to that, I'm a big favour of just a simple Gantt chart. And all I do is download the ones that are publicly available from the web and use those. Yeah. But that, that's just me. It's because I would probably struggle with using the other tools at a technical level, but constructing an easy Gantt chart is straightforward, and it's more important for that Gantt chart to reasonably reflect what you're doing rather than to look pretty. So it doesn't have to have, it doesn't have to be color coded and all the rest of it, so long as it does its job in terms of keeping you on track and monitoring. That's good enough for me.
Yeah. And the other thing that I like to do is have one central place where I try and keep reference to everything. So my project plan will address each of those six elements in some fashion. So it'll address the scope, it'll address the budget, it'll address my timelines. And my timelines might be at the high level. This is when I'm going to start, this is when I'm going to finish, this is when this report is due, but it doesn't necessarily get down into the detail. I might actually have a separate spreadsheet that actually gets down into the detail, that says, okay, right now I do this, but that's dependent upon this next step. And then I put in the dates and times around how long I think that's actually going to take. Now, I don't necessarily always put that into my project plan. I in most cases will keep that separate, but I do put the high level stuff so that I do have something that I can always go back to and continue to monitor, as well as my risks and those sorts of things I will keep in my project plan mostly.
Excellent, thanks. That's really helpful. My question sort of leads on to that. Doesn't look like we have any more questions. So obviously we know lots of effort goes into the actual grant, but obviously these contingency plans and the RACI tools and the Gantt charts are also really important as well. But how much time do we actually have to set out to do one of those, do those charts and things? And is it mainly when we're writing the grant, or is it more the tweaking that we also have to do once we actually start the project? So both ends, when we're writing the grant and also once we've got it, or both, or how do we sort of manage that?
Yeah, so I think that I think your application, your grant application, is really your business case for getting your funding. And then you move, once you've got that, then you move into what I call the initiate stage. So it's really then thinking about, how am I actually going to deliver this project? What is it that I actually need to do? What are the tasks? Who are the people? And what's the budget going to be allocated against each of those people? And then what are my risks? Now, I actually spend quite a bit of time. You may not actually, you know, as far as your project goes, I can't say exactly how long that would actually take, because I think that would vary from project to project, but I do like to plan things out and make sure that it is all documented initially, and make sure that you've got your team and that your team are aware of what it is and what their responsibilities are, what the tasks are, what the deliverables are, and the timelines.
Great.
Yeah, and extending on that, like Tamara said, your proposal is your business case. And the things that I think are critical to your business case are your budget, your governance, and oftentimes, depending on the nature of the grant call, the risk mitigation. The other stuff you do in more detail, like IP, for example, contracts and agreements. You do that after you've got the money.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Doesn't look like there's any more questions, but I'll ask one more then. Again, sort of around when things don't go to plan. And as much as we can try to plan for things, we do have contingency plans. We can't always plan for ethics taking a long time. So particularly when we have grant funds that have to be spent within the year, for example. So how do we manage those sorts of problems when really it's out of our control? We can get grant extensions probably, but sometimes that's not always the case depending where the funding has come from. So do you have any recommendations or suggestions about how we deal with those sorts of situations?
Yeah, I've had lots of experiences along these lines, and the most recent one was in a grant, an NHMRC funded grant that we were implementing during COVID. And because of COVID, you know, the spend wasn't as even across the course of the grant as I'd proposed. And so what was happening was that, you know, I was accumulating lots of unspent funds, and I was at my wit's end about, you know, understanding, you know, how I would manage to retrieve my budget. And what I did was I sought advice. I sought advice from the faculty business manager, and he worked it through with me. I think it's a case of, you know, don't wait till so it becomes, you know, an emergency. Try to act early on and get some support. You know, most organisations, they do value the fact that you've brought in these funds, and they do want to help you to make sure that you, you know, are spending them down in a responsible fashion.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, if Tamara, did you have any further comments? That was a great answer by Deb.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I'm not sure there's much more. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. I can see that there's no further questions. So thank you again, Tamara and Deb, for a fantastic session this afternoon. I think the attendance rate, the questions raised, and your presentations clearly demonstrate the importance of what we've gone through. So, and I'm very confident that all our attendees will take home some great advice and improved understanding of project implementation. So thank you, everyone. That's all for now. Have a great afternoon, and the session is now brought to a close. Thank you.